It went from a former Russian double agent and her daughter being drugged by a nerve agent in the UK to blaming Russia, then expelling Russian diplomats. When all was told and done, over 100 Russian diplomats were expelled from tens of EU countries, not to mention the United States. Even NATO expelled Russian diplomats. Well, in this edition of the debate, we will look at what has led to the biggest mass expulsions of Russian diplomats since the Cold War, and if Russia's accusations holds true that the Europeans have succumbed to U.S. pressure.
As the diplomatic crisis escalates pertaining to Moscow, NATO has announced it is effectively expelling 10 personnel, reducing the Russian mission to the 29-country alliance from 30 to 20.
This sends a clear message to Russia that there are costs and consequences for its unacceptable and dangerous pattern of behaviour.
More than 24 countries have now expelled Russian diplomats over claims from the UK that the Kremlin was behind the poisoning in Salisbury, England 2 weeks ago of Russian ex-spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia, both of whom remain critically ill in hospital. A statement by the Russian Foreign Ministry has been disseminated to the media by the Federation's embassy here in Brussels. A paragraph in the statement reads, "By presenting unfounded charges against the Russian Federation in the absence of explanations of what had happened and refusing to engage in meaningful interaction, the British authorities have de facto adopted a prejudiced, biased and hypocritical stance." We spoke to a former Greek army general who worked with NATO and who now is an EU lawmaker. He told us Russia is being treated unfairly.
Both NATO and the European Union is against Russia. They impose all these restrictions, all these sanctions, all these things, which are not, promoting the cooperation.
The EU's executive arm, the European Commission, says it continues to monitor the situation.
The European Council discussed possible measures. Several leaders were very clear also publicly in saying that there needs to be national discussions on certain steps. This is taking place.
The Kremlin vehemently rejects the claims it was behind the apparent military-grade nerve agent attack in England and says it is continuing to draw up retaliatory measures in response to the expulsion of Russian diplomats. Jerome Hughes, Press TV, Brussels.
Our guest joining us for this edition of the debate, publisher and editor, Politics First, Marcus Papadopoulos joins us from London, and columnist from The Hill, Brzezinski joins us from Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, welcome. Marcus Papadopoulos, let me start with you, and let's take a look at the premise. Now, this is how this news has been covered in response to the poisoning of the former Russian spy and his daughter in the UK earlier this month. And it says that Western countries, most of the news say that they say that it was ordered by Moscow. Even the Russian accusation is not on solid footing, and furthermore, the UK has refused to cooperate or hand over any evidence. So why is that part not being highlighted, and why has the UK refused to cooperate or hand over this evidence, if there's any?
Well, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it? Why will the British government not provide a sample of the alleged nerve agent used in Salisbury to convention? So that leads us to another question. Why is the British government refusing to provide Moscow with a sample of this alleged nerve agent? It is simply unacceptable for the British authorities to say, and I quote, "It is most likely that the Russian state was behind the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal and his daughter." No proper court of law anywhere in the world would convict someone on the basis that he or she is most likely to have committed the crime. I would also add this as well. There is a lot of stupidity being expressed by people regarding potential consequences stemming from the Skripal case. There is not going to be a World War III. No one has declared war on Russia, and diplomatic relations between Britain and Russia are not going to be severed. Yes, it's very serious what happened in Salisbury, but it is part and parcel of, historically speaking, a very troublesome relationship between Britain and Russia.
Papadopoulos, looking at a sample that is not being provided by the UK, and what you have is en masse, more than 14 EU countries, also the United States, to expel the Russian diplomats. It seems like everybody is just, in a sense, just going with the flow of what the UK has decided to do. Isn't that a bit odd?
No. I think the view of almost every allied intelligence agency and law enforcement agency that knows anything about this is that Russia was behind the chemical weapons attack on British soil, period. I hope there are criminal trials where all the evidence is put forward. I think that'll be interesting, and I hope that happens. But when you're talking about diplomatic relations, when you're talking about economic sanctions, it's not a criminal trial. It's a trial of facts based on the evidence for making decisions about expelling diplomats. Europe, by the way, is not succumbing to American pressure, period, end of discussion. This was a chemical weapon attack on British soil, not on America. And it was the British government and almost all the European governments and the European Union and NATO and the United States that are acting together in unison as one to say no and to react. And I think that's one of the most healthy developments that's happened in a while. If I were the Russians, if I were President Putin, what I would do right now is understand that things have changed. When you look at the Russian attacks against the American elections and other issues, when you look at the chemical weapon attack in Britain, when you look at the totality of what's happening, there is now a unity of purpose between all the allied nations. They want an end to this kind of thing. And so all the propaganda, all the excuses, all the evasions mean nothing. We're now at an inflection point, okay? I do expect retaliation on the diplomatic front from Russia. That's the way it usually works, and that'll probably be the way it works now. What I hope happens from Moscow is that the Kremlin understands, that President Putin understands that this is a new day. We are at a major turning point. It is possible that what happens next is you do get a diplomatic overture from Russia. And if that happens, it will be reciprocated by Europe and the United States. We and our allies don't want conflict. We don't want to go into a situation where we're expelling everybody's diplomats. We want to have better diplomats. There will not be World War III. That's correct. I agree with that. But what we have is a Russian attack against Britain using chemical weapons, a Russian attack against the United States using, in this case, technology and espionage and cyber war. It all goes back to General Gerasimov's plan, which President Putin has adopted. And the West collectively is saying no. And the West collectively is unified. And hopefully it'll move into a diplomatic phase where something good can come of this to improve relations if Russia and President Putin understand that the days of acceptance of this by our European allies are over. Period.
Marcus Papadopoulos.
That's the lesson.
Marcus Papadopoulos, go ahead.
Well, that was a grand statement that was completely and utterly unsubstantiated. First of all, can the gentleman provide evidence that most intelligence agencies in the world are of the opinion that the Russian state was behind the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal and his daughter? I haven't heard that claim made, and I'm not aware of any evidence to support that. Secondly, the vast majority of countries in the world are not supporting the British state in its campaign against Russia over the event in Salisbury. So far, we have about 20 countries which are expressing solidarity with Britain, and as a result have expelled a number of Russian diplomats. But that's only 20 or so countries. That means nearly 90% of the countries in the world are refusing to support Theresa May regarding her stance on Salisbury. So we need to be very level-headed. Yes, America is supporting Britain. Yes, Australia is supporting Britain. There's no surprise there. But let's have a look at some of the other extremely powerful countries in the world: China and India, Brazil. The whole of Latin America has refused to show support to the British authorities. So we need to be very careful of sensational statements, statements which have no evidence to hold them up whatsoever. It really is like reading the Sun newspaper in Britain. You have these grand frontline captions, but that's it, nothing else to them whatsoever. Yes, there is a very serious standoff in the world between the West and Russia, and whose fault is that? Who has encroached onto the western borders of the Russian Federation? NATO. And who is the unofficial leader of NATO? The United States. Who has constructed and made operational a missile defense shield on Russia's borders, which is aimed at the Russian nuclear strategic deterrent? Washington has done that. Who has been trying to bring about revolutions in different parts of the former Soviet Union and who have been successful? The Americans. Who have been targeting Russia's allies in the world, from Iran to North Korea to Syria to Libya? The Americans and their allies. So we mustn't be prejudiced. This is the fault of America.
This is what Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Brent Podolsky, has said. He has said when one or two diplomats are being expelled from this or that country, all the while whispering apologies in our ear, we know for sure that this is the result of colossal pressure, colossal blackmail, which is the main instrument of Washington on the international arena. Is he lying?
Yes, he's lying through his teeth. The fact is, the pressure to initiate this round of diplomatic reaction, the removal of Russian spies, Russian diplomats, call them what you will, didn't come from the United States. It came from Britain, and it came from Europe, and it was supported by the United States. Look, I'm not going to waste my time debating the propaganda issues that my colleague raises or what Foreign Minister Lavrov says. I'm going to just tell you what's happening. And what's happening is the West collectively is saying no. And that is it. And they can take it or leave it. Now, my hope, and I wouldn't be surprised if this happens, is that President Putin will take the retaliation everybody assumes he'll take. Okay, go ahead. And then realizes that he has to change himself and his country, the relations with the countries that he's been attacking, whether it's Britain, whether it's elections in Europe, by the way, not just the United States. And if he does the smart thing, after he does the retaliation, I'm assuming he'll do, we might be able to turn this into some diplomatic progress. But I want to be clear, forget the propaganda. Forget the slogans, forget the cliches, forget the Russians are encircled, forget Lavrov, forget all that stuff. It doesn't matter what they think, okay, for this purpose. The West collectively, and there is plenty of evidence. My friend in Britain can read the newspapers and he can find out what the evidence is. I don't have an hour and a half to discuss it. Let me finish. Let me finish. You'll have your. Let me finish. You'll have your chance in a second.
Absolute nonsense.
You'll have your chance in a second.
Absolute nonsense.
But
who wants
well,
to rely on
you can
British
say what
newspapers?
you can say what you want, but I'll tell you what's going to happen.
Okay.
I'll tell you what's going to happen.
We can't understand both of you at the same time. Sorry. Marcus Papadopoulos.
I was speaking and he interrupted me.
Brent Podolsky, go ahead.
I was speaking and he interrupted me.
Go ahead.
The bottom line, and I'll conclude this portion of our debate quickly, that if Russia does a diplomatic initiative, it backs off, whether they admit it or not, better things can happen, relations can improve. If Russia escalates this war, cyber war, chemical war, call it what you want, the next step is going to be sanctions against individual oligarchs and possibly President Putin himself, which is under some discussion in Western circles now. I hope it doesn't come to that. But the propaganda doesn't mean a thing. And I'm not going to waste our audience time by debating propaganda points. I'm going to tell you what's happening in the world and what I hope happens, which will be positive, and what I worry will happen if this continues. The tolerance for these Russian actions has ended. Okay?
Okay.
And there's plenty of evidence. I'm not. If we have an hour and a half someday, we can go over it. Read the British newspapers or any other newspaper that's credible, and you'll know that all these intelligence agencies, as I said, say that Russia did it.
Credible British newspaper.
Go ahead, Marcus Papadopoulos. Go ahead.
Yes, I mean, what we heard just now was, a typical example of American exceptionalism. America can do no wrong in the world, and Russia doesn't have any legitimate concerns. Russia doesn't have any legitimate grievances. The fact that Russia suffered 27 million fatalities in the Second World War and is therefore paranoid about its national security is just kicked to the side by people like the guest in Washington. And let me make another point as well, is that most member states of the European Union are not supporting the British government's stance on Russia. A few of them are, for example, Poland, the Baltic states, France and Germany, but the majority of countries in Europe are not supporting Britain. Now, the guest in Washington says that the West is unified in its opposition to Russia. Well, who compromises the West exactly? America, Britain, perhaps Canada, perhaps Australia? Well, that's just about it. And in regard to Theresa May's
Germany, Poland, Spain, Italy, shall I continue, sir?
She has failed miserably because ideally what Theresa May wanted was for the EU to place additional sanctions on Russia. Well, the Germans and the French do not want to do that. They were reluctant to place sanctions on Russia in 2014. And in 2018, the Germans and the French do not want to see a deterioration even further of their relationship with Moscow. And also Berlin and Paris are acutely aware that in March 2019, Britain will be leaving the European Union. And it is Britain that piled enormous pressure on the Germans and the French in 2014 to place EU sanctions on Russia. So the Germans and the French, being a very strategic people, they are looking to the future. Yes, they are expelling Russian diplomats, not in great numbers, but they do not want to jeopardize their trade with Russia.
Papadopoulos, Putin has said that, based on reports now, we're speculating that he's going to react very harshly because according to the way that it's being described, as you said, the West and the U.S. are saying enough is enough. Putin is saying enough is enough. What kind of retaliation may we expect for it to be described as being harsh from Putin?
Oh, my guess would be, based on the history and the practice, is they will expel diplomats in proportionate numbers to the countries that expelled Russian diplomats. That is expected, and I don't think that's a big deal. I think the big question is, once they do that, how does Russia react next? Do they open the doors to better relations by ending some of their hostilities, in which case there can be better relations, or do they try to escalate it, which would be a big mistake? Now, I just want to quickly address one point about the Second World War. As my colleague and everyone in our audience knows, I mourn for the Russians who gave their lives during the Second World War, but I also remember that when that war began, Joseph Stalin and Russia were allied with Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany while they were attacking Europe, taking over Paris. It's called now you're lying through your teeth, son, and I'm going to call you out on that. Everyone knows what the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was. Stop talking and let me finish. Let me finish.
Marcus Papadopoulos.
Let me finish my point.
Yes. Marcus Papadopoulos, hold on.
That stole Czechoslovakia to Nazi Germany.
Let me finish my point here.
Marcus Papadopoulos.
In our audience.
Okay, Marcus Papadopoulos, hold on.
Son, we're not in Russia. Yeah, we're not in Russia.
We're not in Saudi Arabia.
When it's my turn to talk, I talk. Now, anyone in our audience can Google or search the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, where Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, before the Second World War, reached an agreement. Stalin was on Hitler's side when the war in Europe began. It was a historic mistake. And all that happened is Hitler violated the agreement and invaded Russia. You're interrupting me for the fourth time, and I want you to stop it.
Okay, one second. Marcus Papadopoulos, hold on. Papadopoulos, you finish your statement. Marcus Papadopoulos, you're going to go next. Go ahead, Papadopoulos.
Yeah, and Marcus, we're not in Russia now, and stop trying to have a debate as though we are.
Saudi Arabia as well.
At the beginning of the Second World War, that's the fifth time you've interrupted me. At the beginning of the Second World War, as you know very well, and as every educated person in our audience knows, at the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Stalin was allied with Adolf Hitler. And the only reason that pact broke is not because Stalin didn't end the alliance with Hitler. It's that Hitler ended the alliance with Stalin and invaded Russia.
Okay.
So don't make that argument. I don't think you're going to get very far if you want to be honest and serious with
Quick
our
response.
audience.
Quick response. Papadopoulos, go ahead.
Well, I'll give you a history lesson. When the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed that pact, that was not a pact of friendship. That was a pact signed to give Berlin and Moscow time to prepare for an inevitable conflict with each other. And you conveniently forget, or perhaps you're totally ignorant, I suspect the latter, that from the mid-1930s onwards, the Soviet Union sought collective security with Britain and France and Czechoslovakia and Poland against Nazi Germany. But Paris and London were not interested in the Russian quest for collective security. And Britain and France sold Czechoslovakia to Nazi Germany. That paved the way for the beginning of the Second World War. I suggest you take a lesson in history.
Okay, very well. We're going to unfortunately have to end it there. I do apologize. Maybe you can do a fact check on that and send us your response to newsroom@presstv.ir. But let me thank our guests first, publisher and editor at Politics First, Marcus Papadopoulos, and also columnist at The Hill, Brett Badowski. Thank you both. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, the entire team in the capital, Tehran. It's goodbye.